Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Over dinner, while the steam from the casserole curled like a ribbon and the clink of forks made everything sound more civilized than it felt, my mother raised her glass and, with the kind of smile that announces a verdict disguised as affection, praised my sister and declared in front of everyone at the table that she was the one who made us proud. And in that suspended second when the laughter started and Lauren did her practiced hand-to-chest surprise, I decided not to fight for a share of a toast I was never going to be offered, but to collect the plates, rinse the lipstick from the rim of my mother's goblet, stack the cutlery by size like a tiny marching band, and leave a kitchen so spotless it couldn't be blamed for anything that would happen next. I moved through the cleanup the way a person moves through a story they have already heard too many times, measured and polite and not 1 inch more helpful than necessary, while thinking about how many invisible tasks have a body count of one mine. Because someone has to be the person who knows which insurance email goes to spam and which pharmacy will override a refill date if you sound competent enough on the phone, and someone has to remember that the blue folder in the towel drawer holds the photocopy of the Social Security card, Dad's last voicemail on a cheap flash drive, and a recommendation letter I wrote on cream paper that made Lauren sound like the second coming of logistics, when what she really manages to perfection is lighting. When my mother's toast ended and the air, dense with sugar and approval, held its breath for my reaction, I chose the only line that would not become another argument I would later be instructed to apologize for. I wiped my hands on the dish towel, told my mother I loved her in a voice that did not tremble, kissed her cheek with the gentleness of someone setting down a glass figurine that could crack under its own shine, slid into my coat, and stepped into a night so clean after the rain that it felt like the parking lot had been washed of every tire mark except mine. In my apartment, the silence greeted me like a roommate who pays on time, and I stood for a long moment over my own sink with my own single plate and thought about the privilege of objects that do not ask to be thanked. Then opened the laptop whose password includes a street name from a childhood that still knocks when the house is empty, and navigated to the second email account, the one that exists so bills can be paid without becoming conversation. And I found the quiet river that has been flowing out of my checking account every month to cover the car insurance for the vehicle my sister likes to call fully handled, and I stared at the button that says Manage Autopay the way you stare at a door you have always assumed was locked. There is, despite what people think, nothing dramatic about choosing to stop doing a thing no one thanked you for beginning. The interface asked if I was sure in the gentle tone of a flight attendant offering water before turbulence. And I thought about my mother's glass raised toward the prettier child, about how my sister's captions always say family first while my name sits behind a stack of receipts, and I pressed confirm, and the screen blinked, and something in my chest stood up straight. For the first time in years. My phone lit with a message from Lauren, "Are you okay? You left like a ghost." And I answered with the kind of polite lie that keeps holidays from becoming police reports, telling her I was fine and to drive safe. Adding a heart because habits are harder to cancel than payments. Then I washed my own dish like a ceremonial closing of shift, slid it into the rack, and lay in the dark with the exact weight of the decision pressing pleasantly against my ribs like a book you finally set down after finishing the last chapter. At dawn, the group chat behaved like a fire alarm that cannot be disarmed, and my cousin, who narrates other people's business as if she were paid by the syllable, announced that my mother would not stop crying and that everyone wanted to know what I did. And while I read the message twice, I pictured the kitchen towel folded into a perfect square over the empty counter, and I heard again the small, stunned exhale my mother made when I kissed her cheek, and I understood with a clarity that made me both proud and a little sick that I had not thrown a plate or raised my voice or even refused dessert. I had simply pulled a single thread that has been holding up the costume of our family pageant, which meant the hem would begin to sag on its own. I lay there, staring at the ceiling and hearing the traffic begin to spool up like a city reminding itself to function, and I let myself imagine without flinching. The moment my sister opens her inbox and meets a bill addressed to her instead of to the ghost who keeps making her life look effortless, and I let myself imagine my mother, who treats approval like oxygen. discovering that the oxygen mask did not deploy this time because the person responsible for the cabin is off duty, and I let myself admit that what I did was both petty and principled, a small strike that announced a larger strike was possible. And I felt the first steady beat of something that might be revenge, but might also be finally telling the truth with my actions instead of my apology. The thing about beginning is that it makes more beginning possible. I got up, made coffee strong enough to stand on, and opened the documents I never show anyone. The quiet archive of passwords and scanned forms and drafts of letters that have rescued my mother's reputation more times than her memory can count, and as the kettle clicked and the mug hissed, I hovered over files named like chores, imagining how many of them could be returned to their rightful owners without a speech, and how many would simply evaporate once I stopped holding them together with my calendar and my guilt. The chat buzzed again. What did you do? What did you say? Why did you leave? And I typed 3 words and deleted them, then typed 3 different words and deleted those too. Because everything I wanted to say would sound cruel to people who have never read the 3rd paragraph of any form, and finally I put the phone face down and told the empty room, in a voice that felt like it belonged to someone braver than the fixer I have been since Dad got sick, that I did the dishes, I kissed my mother. And I went home, and that the rest of it is simple math now that the quiet subsidy has ended, which is not a confession but an equation. By the time the sun pushed a pale stripe across my floor, I had decided that the first move would be the only explanation anyone deserved, because explanations are what you give to people who have already decided they do not understand. And consequences are what you give to people who insist they do not need to. So when the next ping from the family thread arrived, hot and breathless, I did not compose a monologue or offer a defense. I poured my coffee, watched the steam rise like a spirit on good terms with leaving, and let the question hang unanswered, because the answer has already been mailed by a billing department that speaks a language Lauren has never had to learn, and the echo of my mother's toast, that polished little dagger, still hung in the air like perfume. By mid-morning, when the kitchen light of memory had faded into the dull, serviceable brightness of a weekday, I drove back to my mother's house under the pretense of returning a casserole dish and instead slipped into the drawer where the clean linens pretend to be guardians of order, lifted the stack of towels that hold a smell like lemon and old starch, and found the blue folder whose cardboard edges have been softened by years of being handled for emergencies no one will admit were predictable. And as I stood there with the drawer open and the hum of the refrigerator insisting that domestic machinery is the only reliable adult in the room, I thought about how a life can be engineered to hide the person who keeps it running. Because every photocopy, every sticky note password, every letter drafted to sound generous, while remaining legally harmless, had my fingerprints all over it, and still I was the quiet ghost in the background of the family photograph smiling as though my absence was a deliberate choice rather than the result of being cropped out. I tucked the folder under my coat, not stealing it, but reclaiming a piece of my own handwriting from a household that treats fonts like miracles and signatures like confetti. Then drove to the church where the parking lot still held last night's rain in small mirrors, and Pastor Jim, who smells faintly of coffee and patience, was already in his office with a cardigan that has absorbed more potluck gossip than any inbox. And I placed on his desk a sealed envelope stamped with the name of the family nonprofit and the word attachments in my careful font, and I said, in the tone you use when you are being both respectful and unmovable, that if the grant application went forward without a real compliance check there would be trouble of the embarrassing, public, and entirely preventable kind, and that inside this envelope he would find not an accusation, but a set of dates, forms, and copied paragraphs that would look innocent to anyone who does not read the 3rd paragraph, which is exactly why I needed him to promise he would open it if the room began to feel like a performance instead of a meeting. He nodded with the calm that comes from baptizing entire families through 3 generations, and said he would hold it, and he would open it only when light was needed. And I believed him because people who deal in grief understand truth like plumbers understand water pressure, so when I left the envelope and walked back across the parking lot, I felt a small internal screw tighten. The satisfying click of a hinge that has just learned how to move without squeaking. In my car, with the heater set to the temperature of steady resolve, I pulled up the state filings for our cheerful little nonprofit, the one my mother brags about as if it were her second daughter. And I scrolled through 2 years of reports that would make any polite donor hum with satisfaction, while a careful eye would notice how certain sentences looked suspiciously polished for someone who claims to write quickly between errands, and how certain dates on signatures did not agree with my sister's travel posts from hotel balconies where the captions used the word blessed more than once, and I drafted the kind of email that honest people call inconvenient and dishonest people call an attack, attaching those public filings with a note that I wanted a standard health check of governance, attribution, and language sourcing, and that my name should not appear on any memo, and that I would pay personally because neutrality is a fragile creature best kept out of the family kitchen. By early afternoon, the auditor, who wrote back with brisk kindness that suggested a person who likes mornings and rules, confirmed receipt and promised a preliminary review by the end of the day, which felt like the administrative version of thunder-scented air. And while I waited, I allowed myself the small theater of normal errands, groceries, a stop for gas, calls placed on speaker so my hands could keep moving, only to be pulled back into the larger drama by a notification that my sister had posted a soft, tasteful carousel from last night, with my hand wiping the table occupying the corner of the final frame like a watermark for service, the caption bleating about family and rising together and gratitude that photographs well. And I imagined the comments blooming with admiration while the bills I had cushioned for years finally turned toward their rightful owner like sunflowers deciding to follow the true sun. When my mother called, her voice wore that delicate frost that suggests she is trying to behave, which always precedes a demand for a script I will not read. And she asked whether I had dropped something at the church and whether I intended to make her look foolish before a pastor who has already heard every confession that can be phrased decently. And I told her I had left an envelope marked light and asked her whether she wanted a grant big enough to demand real oversight or a story big enough to hide the boring parts, because the two are not the same, and she exhaled like a curtain dropping and told me I was being dramatic, which is her word for anyone who insists on facts that have consequences. At dusk, the email arrived with the composure of a weather report and the force of a storm warning, laying out in tidy paragraphs that there was language lifted wholesale from a national template and from a small out-of-state charity's website, that the person listed as program director had signed on dates when her public timeline placed her elsewhere, that none of these issues were criminal in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that would put a larger grant at risk unless governance tightened and credit for labor was assigned accurately, and the auditor asked whether I wanted a formal memo sent to the board's generic inbox with the pastor copied and without my name, and I replied yes with a steadiness that surprised me, followed by a request for training recommendations that would allow the organization to grow up without collapsing. As the apartment slipped into that late-hour blue that always makes me feel like I am underwater and finally breathing correctly, my phone vibrated in a sequence that felt like a drumline announcing the arrival of a parade I had not agreed to attend. Board members asking for a meeting, a donor requesting clarity, my sister buzzing with outrage shaped like innocence, my mother missing a call and then calling again, and while the notifications stacked themselves like dominoes, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the kiss I placed on my mother's cheek, so quiet and precise, and how it might have been the kindest goodbye I could offer to the version of us that requires me to be the flashlight in rooms where everyone else refuses to touch the switch. And somewhere between the third vibration and the silence that followed, the certainty settled that I had not set anything on fire. I had simply stopped standing between a spark and the paper piled in a drawer labeled love. By the time the sun had climbed to the part of the sky where shadows look like decisions you cannot unsign, my phone had bloomed with messages from relatives who love the scent of crisis as long as it does not stain their hands. And I let those notes stack up while I drove to my mother's house for the sort of family meeting that gets called under the false flag of concern, because everyone swears they only want to understand when what they truly want is for the tide to turn back on command. And as I stepped into the kitchen that has served for decades as courtroom, sanctuary, factory floor, and stage, I saw the blue folder open like a patient in Tria, Lauren perched beside it with her glassy, breakable beauty arranged to look unhurt. My aunt stationed like a bailiff at the edge of the table, and my mother holding a pen in the tense grip of someone who believes signatures can bend reality as efficiently as they bend paper. They started with the choreography I know by heart, the polite throat clearing that pretends to be de-escalation while loading the slingshot, the careful invocation of tone that acts as a metal detector for disobedience. And then the first stone flew in the form of my aunt's accusation that I had humiliated my mother by involving the church and the board in what should have remained a family discussion. To which I replied that money wearing a halo is still money and that grown organizations do not survive on holiday speeches and captioned gratitude. They survive on governance that remembers the third paragraph and the boring math of accountability. And when my mother snapped that I was being cruel, I suppressed the impulse to list every quiet intervention I had performed after midnight, every sprint to a notary, every supplier called from a parking lot, every grant question answered while stirring soup for a person who would later say she had handled it herself, and I simply said that I was done furnishing miracles that expired the moment the photo was posted. Lauren leaned forward then, reaching for my hand and missing it on purpose, with a voice that tried to land somewhere between sisterly and superior as she informed me that I had made their work look dishonest, that the memo I triggered would be read uncharitably, that donors were fragile creatures who needed calm stories with clean edges, and I told her that fragility is not the problem when the foundation is cracked, that donors who ask hard questions are not saboteurs but seatbelts, and that the easiest way to manage optics is to let the truth sit in the front row where everyone can see it, at which point she switched tactics and announced that at the very least we all agreed the college fund was sacred and off-limits. A fund she described as communal and family and obviously meant for her daughter since, as my mother added with a mournful flourish, I do not have children to plan for, and, while the wound of that landed with the familiar ache of an injury that never fully healed, I steadied myself and opened the banking app one had refused to open in their presence for years. The phone, cool in my palm like a secret that has decided to free itself, presented the account I had created 6 years ago when a gender reveal cake bled pink and the room erupted in the kind of applause that is really a demand for continued service. And I remembered setting up that transfer on a week when I took on extra side work, telling myself that responsibility could be proactive rather than reactive, and that supporting a child meant building a small seawall before the storm, and as my mother watched with dawning horror and Lauren with the performative calm of someone about to call me a thief, I reminded them that the account had always been in my name, that the deposits had always been my money, that the stories told at baby showers had always been more generous to mythology than to fact, and then, with 3 quiet taps and 1 confirmation code, I changed the beneficiary from the assumption they had decorated like a nursery to a line that read community scholarship in memory of Daniel Carter, which was my father's name sunk into the screen with a dignity I had not felt in that house since the day we carried him out. The outcry arrived in layers, my mother's gasp piercing and immediate like an alarm that cannot locate the fire, Lauren's indignation slick and practiced as she accused me of punishing an innocent child in order to score points against the adults, my aunt's muttered declarations about betrayal and blood, and I stood there absorbing the heat like a wall built to protect a garden that has never been watered, and said that no child loses anything when a scholarship expands the circle of who counts. As ours, that my father had asked in his unpretentious way for us to help the kids who do not have a folder and a fixer. That I was not punishing anyone but rather ceasing to sponsor a lifestyle where gratitude was a public performance and responsibility a private tax on the same tired person. And I refused to be shamed by people who had danced on the safety net and then accused the net of being dramatic when it finally sagged. Lauren demanded to know whether I had sent emails, whether I had called donors, whether I had told Pastor Jim to distrust her, whether I had placed traps, whether I was planning to leak the memo to the few local reporters who still write about anything that does not involve ribbon cuttings, and I answered in the only way that would not spiral into the endless game of prove your loyalty while we test its elasticity, telling her that I had requested transparency, that I had asked for credit, structures that match labor, that I had stopped paying a bill that does not belong to me, and that the next steps would reveal themselves not through my speeches, but through their inboxes, which even they would eventually have to open without me. A hush fell then, not peaceful but taut, the way rooms feel when a storm passes overhead and you count the seconds to the thunder. My mother, in a voice that finally sounded like the woman who used to draw suns in the margins of permission slips, asked what else I had done, and I looked from the folder to the mantel where my father's laughing photograph watched over a kitchen that had remembered to be honest for a heartbeat, and I told her the truth in a single, unadorned line that held more mercy than any apology I could manufacture, that I had done enough to stop being the flashlight in their dark rooms, but not everything I could do, not yet, and that what happened next depended on whether they preferred oxygen or perfume, because I was done trying to make gas smell like air. By late afternoon, when the sun thinned into that paper-colored light that makes neighborhood houses look like sets and not homes, the public narrative had already begun to move at the speed of appearances, which is to say faster than truth can lace its shoes. Because Lauren posted the inevitable carousel with a mug of tea, a cropped corner of the dining room, and a caption about storms revealing roots, and within minutes the comments stacked into a cathedral of sympathy for the daughter who knows how to perform innocence, while my phone throbbed with calls I did not take, and with the kind of messages that use words like heartbreaking and prayer and stay strong without ever risking a question that might require new information to answer. So I made myself a sandwich over the sink like a person paying rent on her own life, and opened a draft that has lived in my email for longer than I care to admit, a small, careful letter titled "Thank You, truly," that I once scheduled for someday and then kept postponing because there is always one more holiday, one more photo op, one more reason to swallow facts in the name of peace, even when the peace is purchased with a currency only I seem to carry. The draft was as plain as a room with good light and 2 chairs, thanking donors in the language of adults rather than the confetti of press releases, listing the names of the people who did the actual work the way you would read a roll call for witnesses rather than saints, and anchoring the gratitude to receipts, meeting dates, and deliverables instead of adjectives. And in the middle of that modest letter I placed 3 sentences my mother wrote to me months ago at an ungodly hour after a long drive, words that she later pretended not to remember because pretending is a family sport, words that said she knew I did everything and did not say it and did not know how to say it and loved me nevertheless, which remained true even if she could only live with it at 2 in the morning when no one applauds, and underneath those sentences I attached a single page that held, side by side, the national template paragraph and the nonprofit's original paragraph as they appeared in the last grant application, not to shame anyone but to make it impossible to confuse inspiration with copy and paste, and I added one clean condition at the end, that if the organization accepted new money it would also adopt clear governance and equal credit for labor, including mine, otherwise I would withdraw, not in a rage, but the way a pillar withdraws when you finally notice it was always load-bearing. I scheduled the send for 5 minutes past 5 to the board's generic inbox, to the donors list I should not have had but did because labels and postage live in the same world as tax forms and crisis emails, and to Pastor Jim, who understands the difference between grace and silence. Then I placed my phone face down like a gambler turning away from the table before the wheel slows, and I stood with both hands flat on the counter in a posture I recognize from every emergency I have resolved, prepared to feel nothing or everything when the first reply arrived, which it did in less than 1 minute with the crisp tone of responsible adults. Because a board member wrote that they had not realized the degree of ghost labor and that a meeting in the morning would be appropriate, another asked for documentation that would allow them to repair trust rather than merely express it. A donor requested a conversation about optics that actually sounded like a conversation about substance, and Pastor Jim sent exactly 6 words, "The truth loves light," and then left it at that, which felt like a benediction rather than a verdict. Lauren, who cannot metabolize any conversation that does not bend toward applause, came at me in a thread of messages that alternated between saccharine and lawsuit, accusing me of orchestrating a spectacle to punish her, insisting that the board would collapse under the weight of negativity, warning that donors hate drama more than they hate dishonesty, and threatening to go public with the story that I had sabotaged a fund for her child, even though a scholarship in our father's name is the opposite of sabotage. And I typed 3 replies that would have been satisfying but not useful, then erased them and wrote only that transparency is not a performance, it is an air supply, and if a system cannot breathe it should not take money. After which I silenced the thread because it had the pitch of a smoke alarm that goes off when you boil water. At 6:30, as if a curtain pulled back on an act I had not rehearsed, a board member whose name I barely remembered texted me a photograph taken in my mother's kitchen. A close shot of the blue folder open beside the cream paper letter I had once written on my mother's request. A sticky note on top in my mother's handwriting that said return to sender, followed by I'm sorry in smaller letters that looked like someone learning how to write with her non-dominant hand, and while I knew that apologies written on paper can be performative landmines designed to be admired rather than used, I also recognized the tremor in the pen strokes, the same tremor I have seen when she ties her apron or clips a coupon, which meant that something had shifted in the private economy of her certainty, even if the exchange rate would fluctuate wildly before morning. The apartment had gone that deepening blue that turns objects into outlines and makes you aware of your own breathing, and I poured water and did not drink it, waiting for the next instrument in the orchestra to come in, which it did in a small cascade of notifications that felt like rain on a roof you finally repaired, a calendar invite for a 9 a.m. board meeting with an agenda that included governance policy, a flagged email from an insurer with a payment due notice clearly addressed to Lauren rather than to the ghost account that once disguised the bill, a missed call from my mother followed by a second missed call, which is her way of saying urgency while pretending to be polite, and a note from Pastor Jim that he had, at the board's request, retrieved the sealed envelope, which he would open only in the room, and at that I experienced a calm so unadorned it almost felt like hunger, the bodily knowledge that I had stopped feeding a machine that runs on me. I stood by the window, watching a neighbor return home with a bag of groceries and a paper bouquet, and I let the silence stretch into something that felt less like emptiness and more like space. Understanding that whatever story reached the group chat tonight would be the cheap version sold in bulk, that the real narrative would be written tomorrow at a folding table with coffee in paper cups and a memo in bullet points, where adults would have to decide whether they loved the idea of goodness or the work of it, and that my mother's tears, which had apparently gathered an audience by now, were not the evidence of my cruelty, but the cost of finally seeing who has been standing in the light and who has been supplying it. And whether she chooses to hold that knowledge is not a test I can study for or pass for her, which is the point, the lesson, the consequence, and the freedom, all arriving at once like whether you saw on radar and chose to believe anyway. The board meeting convened at 9 the next morning in a church basement that smelled of instant coffee and craft glue from decades of Sunday school projects, a room lined with folding tables that carried the weight of decisions larger than their chipped surfaces suggested. And as I sat in one of the metal chairs with my hands folded in my lap, I felt both the absurdity and the inevitability of my presence there, the daughter who had not been toasted at dinner now occupying the role of witness and instigator in a drama my family swore was a misunderstanding, but which had already drawn auditors, donors, and pastors into its orbit. My mother sat across from me with her paper cup of coffee crushed into a soft fan between her fingers, a prop that betrayed the tremor in her hands, and Lauren slid in late with sunglasses still on. The universal costume for someone who intends to perform fragility while hiding calculation. Pastor Jim opened with a prayer that was shorter than any I had heard him say before, more like a gasp than a liturgy, and then he nodded toward the auditor who dialed in remotely, his voice precise and gentle as he confirmed what we all knew but no one wanted to say out loud, copied language, inconsistent signatures, a structure that looked neat until you actually placed weight on it, and nothing criminal yet everything sloppy, fixable only through honesty and equal credit for those who do the work. My mother leaned forward, her voice heavy with a grief so rehearsed it nearly sounded convincing, and she announced that her daughter was trying to ruin them, that I had made family business into gossip, that I was punishing everyone with facts, And I replied in a tone so steady it startled even me that I was not ruining anything. I was simply removing myself from the middle, because I was not born to be a middle but a person. And that what collapses without my invisible labor was never stable. To begin with. Lauren, quick to fill silence with indignation, snapped that I had betrayed her child by stealing a college fund, and I corrected her without apology that I had reallocated my own money, the account I created, into a scholarship bearing our father's name, and that a child does not lose when the circle of who counts as ours widens beyond one living room, and that the only thing betrayed was her sense of entitlement to work she had not performed. Pastor Jim cleared his throat in the careful way of a man who has officiated enough funerals to know when silence is heavier than words, and he said governance could be fixed, but hearts could only be opened from the inside. And though it sounded like a platitude, the line landed in the room like a stone in water. I pulled out my phone not to read emails, but to press play on a voice memo I had carried in silence for years, the last voicemail from my father, his voice thin and sweet as he told me that he was proud, that I always did the hard things and pretended they were easy, and that I should not do that forever, and then the sound of a door closing, ordinary and final, filled the room until no one could breathe without hearing him, and I watched my mother's hand fly to her mouth, the paper cup folding in on itself, while Lauren's sunglasses could not shield her from looking suddenly like a child whose map has been stolen. I said nothing more than that I kissed my mother last night because I wanted to leave her with something true, not a speech or a fight, only love, and that love does not mean silence when silence is a kind of theft. My mother's eyes overflowed, and she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" And I told her, because I am tired of being the flashlight they all expect to follow them into dark rooms, that I cannot keep guiding people who will not turn on the switch, that I will go blind if I keep illuminating lives that refuse to acknowledge I am holding the light. The board moved forward with business, voting to table Lauren's grant until governance was corrected, drafting policies for equal credit, and hiring the auditor for training. Their voices crisp and practical as if they were discussing roofing estimates rather than family fault lines, and the ordinariness of their decision was what struck me most, that my family's theater had shrunk into bullet points and votes. The kind of boring order that keeps organizations alive and egos wounded. When the meeting ended, my mother found me in the hallway clutching the blue folder like a baby, telling me she had placed my cream paper letter on top with a sticky note that read "Return to sender" and "I'm sorry." Admitting she did not know if she meant it right, but that she had written it anyway, and then she pressed into my hand a ring from her mother, the one promised to Lauren because her fingers were prettier, telling me my father had wanted me to have it and that maybe she had delayed too long because admitting I deserved it meant admitting she had been wrong. I looked at the ring, a small circle honest in its simplicity, and said it was not a crown but a loop, and she whispered that she kept forgetting that difference. Outside, the air was brisk and clean, the kind of morning that forces your lungs to admit they are alive, and my phone buzzed with messages stacking like dominoes, overdue bills addressed finally to Lauren, governance updates from the board, a donor offering to support the new scholarship, my mother calling again and again from the porch, her voice breaking when she finally said that she had listened to my father's message 3 times and realized she had forgotten the way he said my name. I told her I had not sent that recording to wound her but to remind her what love sounds like, and she nodded through tears that did not belong to donors or optics or captions, but to a woman remembering something she had buried in her own silence. And she murmured that everyone was still asking what I had done, and she told them, almost smiling, that I had done the dishes. I walked to my car with the ring in my pocket warm against my leg, the voicemail saved in 3 places humming like an engine inside my chest. And as the group chat pinged again with demands for answers, I typed and erased replies until finally I wrote only that I told the truth and the rest is theirs. And I drove away, not fast or slow, but at the speed of someone who has laid down a burden she carried so long it had become mistaken for her spine, leaving behind a family that may never agree on whether I had broken them or saved them, but knowing that for the first time in years the story no longer depended on me to hold it upright.